The war did not begin for him with gunfire or explosions, but with silence. It was the silence of early morning on a coastal base, where the air smelled of salt and oil, and the sea lay flat and gray beneath a sky still undecided about rain. He stood alone for several minutes before speaking to anyone, his uniform pressed, his sword resting at his side more as symbol than weapon. In those quiet moments, his thoughts returned to lessons learned long before the war. Lessons drilled into him not through manuals but through repetition, ritual, and expectation. Honor was not an abstract concept. It was a structure that ordered his life, defining what could be endured and what could not be forgiven. He had been raised to believe that clarity of purpose was the highest virtue. His instructors spoke of duty as something heavier than fear and stronger than instinct. Obedience was not submission, they taught, but alignment was something greater than the self. To fail in this alignment was not merely to err, but to fracture the moral order that bound soldier, family, and nation together. As he advanced through the ranks, these beliefs hardened into certainty. Promotions followed discipline. Praise followed restraint. Doubt, when it surfaced, was treated like an illness to be corrected, not explored. By the time the empire moved decisively toward war, he was already a seasoned officer, trusted with men, supplies, and territory. His responsibilities were clearly defined on paper, but less so in practice. He was expected to maintain order, enforce doctrine, and prepare for engagements that planners describe with confidence and abstraction. Maps showed arrows moving smoothly across oceans and islands. Timetables promised decisive outcomes, yet even before the first shots were fired, he sensed that the world those maps described did not fully exist. Weather did not follow. Schedules' engines failed. Men carried private fears no training could erase. Still, when orders arrived, he accepted them without visible hesitation. The language of command left little room for interpretation, and he believed that questioning intent weakened resolve. Around him, younger officers mirrored his composure, drawing reassurance from his calm presence. To them, he represented continuity, the unbroken line of tradition stretching back through generations of service. He understood the weight of that perception and bore it carefully, aware that his behavior shaped not only outcomes, but identities. As the conflict widened, reports filtered in from distant fronts. Victories were announced with ceremonial pride, yet losses were mentioned only briefly, reduced to numbers and locations. He read between the lines, noting how often units were described as having fought to the end. The phrase carried honor, but also finality. In private, he wondered how many ends could be endured before the structure he believed in began to crack. Such thoughts remained unspoken, confined to the narrow space between duty and conscience where no official language existed. Daily life on the base continued with rigid regularity. Drills were conducted, equipment inspected, communications rehearsed. The rhythm was designed to suppress uncertainty, to keep minds focused on tasks rather than implications. At night, however, when the noise subsided and the darkness pressed closer, the commander felt the strain of maintaining certainty in an environment increasingly shaped by variables beyond control. He listened to the wind moving through cables and canvas, a sound that reminded him how exposed everything truly was. The first tangible signs of the modern war reached him not through battle, but through logistics. Supplies arrived late or incomplete. Replacement parts did not match specifications. Fuel was rationed more strictly than planned. Each small discrepancy suggested a larger imbalance. A system stretched thin by demands that no amount of discipline could fully resolve. He addressed these issues methodically, issuing directives, adjusting schedules, refusing to display concern. To show doubt, he believed, was to invite disorder. Yet the men noticed changes all the same. They noticed how often he studied the horizon, how frequently he reread orders already memorized. They noticed his silence after receiving certain dispatches. Respect did not diminish, but it deepened into something more complex. Tinged with unease, he sensed this shift and felt responsible for containing it. Leadership, as he understood it, required absorbing uncertainty so others would not have to. Culturally, he was anchored by an idea of war that emphasized sacrifice as purification. Hardship was expected to refine resolve, not erode it. Death, when it came in service of the emperor, a nation, was framed as meaningful, even beautiful in its finality. These ideas had sustained generations before him, but now they were being tested by a conflict that moved faster, reached farther, and consumed more than any tradition had anticipated. Air power ignored borders. Naval engagements erased distance. Industrial capacity determined outcomes long before individual valor could intervene. As weeks turned into months, the gap between doctrine and experience widened. He remained committed to the ideals that shaped him, but he could no longer deny the evidence accumulating around him. Modern warfare did not pause for moral reflection. It rewarded adaptability, deception, and overwhelming force. Honor alone could not repair a damaged aircraft or replace a sunken ship. This realization did not arrive as a revelation, but as a slow, uncomfortable erosion of certainty. Standing on the edge of that awareness, he faced the central conflict of his life. He was a man trained for moral clarity, entering a war defined by ambiguity and speed. His instincts urged him to preserve tradition, to act as a stabilizing force amid chaos. Reality, however, pressed him toward decisions that tradition had never prepared him to make. In that tension, quiet but relentless, the true beginning of his war took shape. He did not yet know how far the tension would carry him, or what it would demand in return. He only knew that the world he was sworn to defend was changing, and that change was advancing faster than any formation he could command under his careful, watchful eyes. The war widened around him not as a single decisive blow, but as a tightening field of pressure that touched every aspect of command. Orders arrived more frequently now, often revised, sometimes contradicting what had come only days before. Strategic priorities shifted as enemy movements forced adjustments that no doctrine had fully anticipated. He read each directive carefully, noting what was said and what was absent, aware that omissions often carried more meaning than instructions. The confidence that once defined planning documents had thinned into cautious language shaped by uncertainty and loss. Operational reality asserted itself first through terrain and weather. Island airstrips turned to mud under seasonal rains. Grounding aircraft meant to provide air cover. Roads carved through jungle deteriorated faster than engineers could repair them, choking supply lines that had been calculated under ideal conditions. Salt air corroded metal relentlessly, shortening the lifespan of vehicles and weapons alike. These were not dramatic setbacks, but constant degradations that eroded capability day by day. The commander adjusted schedules and reassigned duties, aware that every compromise carried hidden costs. Resource shortages followed, subtle at first, then undeniable. Fuel allocations were reduced, forcing difficult choices between patrols and training flights. Ammunition reserves no longer allowed for the margins of error once considered essential. Medical supplies dwindled, and wounded men were stabilized rather than restored. Each rationing decision demanded a justification that aligned with honor. While acknowledging necessity, he framed these choices carefully, presenting them as tests of endurance, rather than signs of decline, even as the strain became visible in the faces of his officers. Enemy tactics evolved faster than anticipated. Air raids struck at unpredictable hours, exploiting gaps in coverage created by limited radar and exhausted crews. Naval movements avoided decisive engagements, instead isolating outposts and forcing defenders to stretch resources thin across wide areas. The commander studied reports of these actions with growing concern. The enemy did not seek honor in confrontation. They sought efficiency, disruption, and attrition. Against such methods, rigid adherence to traditional responses proved increasingly ineffective. Within his own ranks, fatigue accumulated quietly. Men performed their duties with discipline, but the sharpness that once defined drills softened. Conversations grew shorter, laughter rarer. Letters from home, when they arrived, spoke of shortages and air raids, extending the war's reach into personal lives. The commander observed these changes without comment, understanding that acknowledgement might amplify them. He believed that steadiness, even silence, could serve as a form of protection. Civilians entered his calculations more often now. Villages near the base depended on military supply lines that no longer functioned reliably. Requests for food, medical aid, and protection arrived daily, each one a reminder that the war's consequences extended beyond uniforms. He weighed these appeals against orders that prioritized combat readiness above all else. Honor demanded compassion, yet strategy demanded restraint. Balancing the two became an exercise in compromise that left no one fully satisfied. Each decision narrowed his options further, reinforcing one position, weakened another. Conserving fuel limited mobility. Delaying action preserved strength but ceded initiative. He began to sense how modern war punished inflexibility not through sudden collapse, but through cumulative disadvantage. The ideals that had guided him assumed a clarity of engagement that no longer existed. Instead, he faced a conflict defined by overlapping crises, where delay and hesitation could be as damaging as defeat. Losses mounted without ceremony. Patrols failed to return. Aircraft vanished over water without distress signals. Reports listed names, ranks, and circumstances in neutral language that masked the finality beneath. He read each report personally, committing details to memory as an act of respect. Yet even this ritual could not restore meaning to losses that achieved no discernible gain. Honor, he realized, did not guarantee purpose. Physically, the war imposed its toll on him as well. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by alerts and the persistent hum of generators. Meals were eaten quickly, often cold, their taste secondary to efficiency. His body adapted to this rhythm, but his mind resisted. In rare moments of solitude, he felt the weight of accumulated decisions pressing inward, each one justified in isolation, yet collectively reshaping the war into something unrecognizable from the principles he had been taught. The recognition arrived gradually, without drama. He understood that the values he defended were not wrong, but incomplete. They had been forged in conflicts where scale and speed allowed individual virtue to influence outcomes. This war operated differently. Industrial capacity, intelligence networks, and logistical depth determined success more reliably than courage or sacrifice. To acknowledge this was not to abandon honor, but to confront its limits. By the chapter's end, his command continued to function, disciplined and intact, yet fundamentally altered. He carried forward out of obligation, not illusion. The war no longer promised to reward the qualities that had shaped him, but he upheld them nonetheless, aware that survival now depended as much on adaptation as conviction. In that quiet understanding, forged through fatigue and constraint, the distance between the world he believed in and the war he fought became unmistakably clear. The final phase of his command arrived without ceremony, carried on the same currents of routine that had defined the war's slow grind. There was no decisive order, no singular moment of collapse, only a steady confirmation that the limits he had sensed were now unavoidable. Artillery spoke with greater frequency, its distant concussions rolling across the landscape like an impersonal verdict. Aircraft passed overhead with mechanical indifference, their presence shaping behavior even when no bombs fell. The battlefield had expanded beyond any one commander's influence, governed by forces that operated at scales too large for individual resolve to meaningfully alter. He continued to issue orders with precision, though their purpose had shifted. Where once he sought advantage, now he sought containment. Positions were held not to advance but to delay. Resources were distributed to preserve coherence rather than momentum. Men followed these directives with the same discipline they always had, yet the meaning beneath their actions had changed. Survival replaced ambition. Endurance replaced expectation. The commander observed this transition without protest, recognizing it as an adaptation rather than a failure. As engagements intensified, the disparity between intention and outcome grew clearer. Batteries fired according to doctrine, but enemy counterfire arrived faster and heavier, guided by intelligence and coordination that negated careful positioning. Aircraft that rose to defend airspace returned, damaged or not at all, undone by superior numbers and technology. Each loss reinforced a truth that no amount of honor could refute. Courage did not neutralize explosives, and devotion did not alter trajectories. War had become an equation measured in tonnage, range, and production capacity. He walked among his men whenever circumstances allowed. His presence quiet and unadorned. There were no speeches, no appeals to sacrifice beyond what duty already demanded. He understood that words could not restore what had been stripped away by months of attrition. Instead, he offered consistency. Orders were clear. Decisions were timely. Expectations were realistic. In this, he maintained a form of honor that adapted to reality rather than denying it. Civilians continued to pass through his considerations, their movements shaped by the same forces constraining his command. Evacuations displaced families who had lived on the land for generations. Fields lay untended. Buildings once used for commerce or worship became shelters or targets depending on circumstance. He authorized what assistance he could, knowing it was insufficient. The war's scale reduced compassion to logistics, forcing even humane intentions into the language of allocation and priority. The end did not arrive as a single event, but as a convergence. Supply lines failed completely. Communication with higher command became intermittent, then ceased. Enemy forces advanced not with spectacle but with inevitability, supported by an apparatus that absorbed losses without slowing. The commander faced these developments with measured acceptance. There was no illusion left to defend. The structure he served had been overtaken by a form of warfare that rendered individual codes secondary. In his final decisions, he chose order over gesture. Equipment was disabled to prevent capture. Records were secured or destroyed according to protocol. Men were instructed on surrender procedures. With clarity and restraint, stripped of rhetoric, honor, he concluded, lay not in futile resistance, but in preserving life where no purpose remained in its expenditure. This choice carried its own weight, conflicting with teachings that equated surrender with disgrace. Yet the war itself had rewritten those equations, forcing adaptation or annihilation. When the moment came, it passed quietly. Weapons were lowered, flags changed, the soundscape shifted from explosions to commands spoken in unfamiliar accents. He stood among his men, his posture unchanged, his expression neutral. There was no relief, only a settling of tension that had defined their existence for years. The war moved on without them, its momentum unaffected by individual endings. In the aftermath, reflection replaced action. He considered the path that had led him there, not with regret, but with clarity. The values that shaped him had not been false, but they had been outpaced. World War II had transformed conflict into an industrial process, where morality struggled to keep pace with machinery, and strategy operated far above personal experience. Within that transformation, honor survived only when it adapted, shedding absolutes in favor of responsibility. His legacy did not reside in victory or defeat, but in witness. He had seen the transition from tradition-bound warfare to total war, from individual agency to systemic force. In that witnessing lay a quiet truth about the age he inhabited. The war reshaped nations and borders, but it also redefined what it meant to serve with honor standing at that intersection. He embodied a generation caught between inherited ideals and an unforgiving modern reality, leaving behind not a lesson of triumph, but an understanding of inevitability that would outlast the silence of the guns.